Yu-Gi-Oh is an ever-changing game, with new and old cards coming in on the meta all the time. And in this video we'll go over cards which people thought would change the game, but ended up not doing much at all. Starting us off at number 10, we have Crystal Seer. This is a level 1 spellcaster which has 100 attack and defense, and when it's flipped you excavate the top 2 cards of your deck, and pick one to go to your hand, then place the other on the bottom. Seer came out in the middle of the GX era, in a format dominated mostly by monarchs. Rise of the Storm Monarch was one of the strongest tribute monsters at the time, letting you stack a card from the field on top of your opponent's deck, a deadly combo together with Phoenix Wing Windblast. Seer was hyped not only as a consistency tool, but also a reason for Monarch decks to go back to using Apprentice Engine. Apprentice Magician used to be the best recruiter to play since it could float into either itself, Old Vindictive Magician, who can pop a card on the field, or Magician of Faith, who can recover a spell from the graveyard. There were lots of parallels between the latter, in fact, since they were both level 1 spellcasters that got you back advantage, but Faith itself had been banned at the time. The issue with Seer is that its effect wasn't nearly as good to make up for its pitiful stats. Dekoichi had nearly the same payoff while also being usable as a beater. As a cherry on top, they even unbanned Magician of Faith for a format just a couple of weeks before Crystal Seer, its supposed replacement, dropped. All of this happened quite early in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, and at least Pot of Duality, a card with a similar effect but on a spell card instead, did impact the game as much as Crystal Seer was expected to many years later, so this card is at a pretty low spot on this list. And today's video is brought to you by Factor. Factor is a meal planning service which sends you meals that all you need to do is heat up and they're pretty much good to go. For me personally, I'm really busy, I don't particularly like cooking, and I also want to eat healthy since I started weightlifting, and I needed better foods than just fast foods in order to improve my diet for that. But more importantly than everything else is the fact that the food is actually good. I made sure to try it out first before I accepted any kind of deal with Factor, so I can tell you from personal experience that it's actually great. Factor also allows you to customize which meals they send every week, with 4 to 18 options available based on your dietary needs, and allows you to easily skip weeks if you need to. Use my link or go to gofactor75.com and use code POGDUEL130 to get $130 off across 6 boxes. Once you click, my description will live update to count the purchases. And coming in at number 9, we have Dark Worlds. The Dark World structure deck was set to be released in late 2011, and it had many powerful cards that looked like they would break the meta. This archetype is made out of a series of monsters that get their effects when discarded, but only when discarded by effects and not cost. So they don't work on cards like Raigeki Break, and also they gain bonus effects when discarded by an opponent's card. Silva and Gold had been seen play as tech against cards that discard random cards from your hand like Spirit Reaper and Don Zalug in earlier metas, but at the time the archetype didn't have enough engine to be played by itself. The new structure deck was supposed to change them, giving them strong consistency tools like Snow, who can add a Dark World card when discarded, and Gates of the Dark World, which lets you discard them for effect and draw a card at the same time. But the most hyped of them was certainly Grapha, which could only be special summoned by returning another Dark World monster from your field to your hand, and when discarded would let you pop a card on the field, all while being a 2700 attack beat stick. The hype was so much that even Konami hopped on it, who did their coverage of the next big event while roleplaying as Grapha itself on their blog. Players feared the deck, and after release, many would cite in many direct counters to the strategy in Shadow Imprisoning Mirror and DD Crow. All of this hype just for the deck to get 0 top cut slots in the next event, being heavily outclassed by other meta decks of the time, like Plant Synchro and Agents. Results which Konami tried to explain by saying that it was only because the new Dark World support card, Dark Smog, hadn't been released yet. Dark Worlds did go on to get a couple of tops later on, it just wasn't the dominant force it was made out to be at first. And at number 8, we have another structure deck, the Lair of Darkness structure deck, named appropriately after its main card, Lair of Darkness. This is a field spell card that turns all monsters in the field to dark. Its main effect is that if you would tribute monsters as activated card effects, you can tribute your opponent's dark monsters for them instead. Then, during the end phase, the turn player gets as many torment tokens as possible in defense position up to the number of monsters tributed this turn. Tributing monsters as cost is still one of the most powerful forms of removal in the entire game, and this deck would allow you to do it without going minus, which was even better than using kaijus. The other cards revealed all synergize perfectly with the strategy, with the field spell searchers and ways to tribute off your opponent's monsters at quick effect speed. Additionally, field spell decks were much better back then because terraforming hadn't been limited to 1 yet. The deck came out first in the OCG, where it became a widely used strategy combined with Infernoids, an archetype where almost every monster needs a tribute to activate its effect, giving it perfect synergy with Lair. But when it finally came out to the West, it barely did anything. The issue was how powerful every other deck at the time was in comparison, with the likes of Sky Striker and Triple Engage, and Goki with both Isolde and Nightmare Mermaid. How can a deck that dies to a single MST compete? Some of the cards in the structure deck did end up seeing play in other decks, such as Lilith and trap-heavy strategies, or Diabolos as a Tech and Sky Striker at least. Still, despite the disappointment at first, Lair Infernoids did eventually manage to get a few tops in lower powered metas as a rogue pick. And at number 7, there's Crossout Designator, a quick play spell that allows you to banish a card from your deck to negate the effects of cards with the same name until the end of this turn on a hard once per turn. Crossout's main use is negating hand traps like Ash Blossom and Nibiru, since you can't chain it to their activation on your turn as long as you play a copy of them yourself. This ability to negate hand traps is what made Called by the Grave see play in almost every deck, and even got it on the limited list. Even if you don't need to use it defensively, you can still set it and use it during your opponent's turn. This can be devastating in mirror matches, and there's always a chance you can use it to negate a staple like Prod of Prosperity during your opponent's turn. This card saw a ridiculous amount of play in the OCG, and was even put on their ban list in the same month it was released in the West. All the anticipation made this card into the most expensive of its set, and then the card went on to see little play in the following months. The TCG and OCG metas are so different that Crossout didn't become nearly as much of a staple as it is over there. The main reason is because Max C is not legal in the West, and the card by itself is a turn ender for every deck that special summons more than a couple of times, with Crossout being one of the few counters. So even though it was a staple over there, it was just a rare side pick inclusion here. Recently, Crossout's been mostly in Despia decks, since it's the only generic card that can counter both of its biggest counters. But that's still nothing compared to how it was in the OCG, who had to put it all the way down to 1 eventually. And at number 6, we have Naturia Pineapple, a level 2 earth plant that turns all monsters you control into plants. Also, during your standby phase, if it's in your graveyard and you don't have any back row and only plants and beasts in the graveyard, it can special summon itself from the graveyard. The Naturias were a quite mediocre archetype at the time. Their situation was exactly like the Ice Barriers, where their synchros were good to play in other decks, but they didn't really work by themselves. Pineapple was supposed to fix that, being a TCG exclusive card released at the highest rarity available, just like the previous meta breaker Gateway of the Six. This monster is extremely similar to Treeborn Frog, a card which had been a mainstay in the meta for a few years before itself. It was supposed to give you easy tribute fodder for the only good main deck Nature monster at the time, Naturia Bamboo Shoot, which locks your opponent completely out of spell traps. The theorized Pineapple Cat deck made this Naturia card hit really high prices at first, as it had to use Rescue Cat's engine to give Naturias more combo while staying within Pineapple's restriction. Not only did it not live up to the hype, Rescue Cat would also get banned just a couple of weeks after the card came out. There weren't any easy ways to set up Pineapple in the graveyard deck like Treeborn Frog had. Also, even if Bamboo Shoot actually had a good effect, it'd lose its effect completely if it got hit by Effect Veiler, which was a staple in almost every deck. Additionally, since its stats were on the lower side for tribute monsters, you'd need to run a lot of defensive cards to keep it alive, all of which would turn off your Pineapple due to its restriction. The deck just couldn't compete with the meta threats at the time, like X-Sabers, and once again, outside of their synchro monsters, the Naturias were forgotten. And at number 5, we have Magical Musketeers, a series of fiend monsters with a very interesting gimmick. They all let you activate Magical Musketeer spell traps from your hand while on the field, and then they have an additional effect when a spell trap is activated in the same column as one of them. They were announced at the beginning of the Link era, and the Magi Bullets, as they were called at the time, were instantly propped up as the second coming of Zodiacs, which had just left the meta with the banning of Trident and Broadball. Caspar and Doc set your advantage engine by letting you get Magical Musketeer spells from both your deck and graveyard every turn. The deck even had a powerful draw effect with Kid Brave, and even Zodiac Barrage-like effect with Starfire. The spell trap lineup was no slouch either, with quick effect pops, graveyard disruption, and monster and spell trap negates. However, this deck could not possibly have been released at the worst time in the TCG, being dropped in the middle of a format mostly dominated by Spiral. The Magical Musketeer Advantage engine was good in theory, but there was no way to keep up with combo decks using tools like Ancient Fairy Dragon and Pre-Errata Fireball Dragon. When it came to the slower decks, the deck was worse than Trickstars, which had a much more compact engine as well as a way to win the game instantly with Reincarnation and Drill and Lockbird combo, banishing your opponent's whole hand. So the new Zodiacs were left to rot, never really finding their place competitively as the meta progressed and left them behind. They managed to secure themselves a few top spots years later, however, with the release of the Link monster and Magical Musketeer Max, before fading off completely again. And at number 4, we have Spell Chronicle. This is a continuous spell card that requires you to send your entire hand to the graveyard to activate it, and then it banishes 5 spell or trap cards from your deck. Then, each time your opponent activates a spell card, you place 1 Chronicle counter on it. You can remove 2 of these counters and let your opponent choose one of those banished cards to add to your hand. And if this card ever gets destroyed, you take 500 damage for each of the cards still banished by its effect. Despite sounding like some terrible pack filler, this card managed to get an amazing amount of excitement surrounding it years after its release in Duelist Alliance format. What happened is that, as a joke or otherwise, this card was hyped by multiple competitive players at once, with some even saying they were going to buy all copies of Spell Chronicle that they could. The most baffling explanations on why this card were good were given, such as being able to use it to trigger your Shadow effects, despite it sending cards for cost and not effect, so it couldn't even trigger the Shadow effects. This all resulted in the almost useless card skyrocketing in price from night to day, as everyone wanted to get their hands on the new meta as soon as they could. Even though the rest of the player base kept theorizing why this card was supposed to be so good, by thinking it should be used with Primal Seed to get cards back or trigger BA effects, no one could really figure out why it was supposed to be so good. This would only last a couple more days before everyone who bought in realized it was a joke and they had all been duped. The hype dissipated, and so did the discussion and price speculations around this card shortly after. Funnily enough, half a decade later, they actually released a card that coupled very well with this with the Witchcrafter's Patronus. After activating Spell Chronicle, it could be used to add all the cards back to your hand, as long as they were Witchcrafter cards. But even that was too inconsistent to ever see play. And coming in at number 3, we have Senet Switch. This is a continuous spell that lets you, once per turn, move one monster on your side of the field to an adjacent horizontal unoccupied monster card zone. Even though this reads like one of the most do-nothing cards in the whole game, Senet Switch's demand soared during the final days of Master Rule 3. The new Master Rule was announced, and the player base would slowly learn about link summoning and the extra monster zone mechanic. Since you would need to special summon extra deck monsters to either the extra monster zone or zones a link monster pointed to, people looked for cards that could potentially free up your extra monster zone. It's important to say that this card actually received an errata after Master Rule 4, as it used to not say horizontal in its card text, so it was thought of as one of the best ways to free up your extra monster zone to allow you to keep playing. This was not the only card to get hyped up due to zone shenanigans, since other zone manipulating cards that were just pack fillers before came into the spotlight, like Ground Collapse, which people thought you could use to block the extra monster zone. But of course, as more information came to light and all cards that mentioned zones were errated, Senet Switch went back to its obscurity. This wasn't the first or last time cards got hyped due to a misunderstanding like this. Around the same era, there was also a rumor that Konami would increase the life point starting value to 16,000 to slow the game down, leading to buyouts of the card Ancient Leaf since it's Pot of Greed if your life points are over 9,000. Funnily enough, Senet Switch became relevant again in 2022 with the release of the Valence archetype, a series of pendulum monsters which all get their effects off when they change zones. Their most recent piece of support in the OCG can even search Senet Switch itself from the deck. And coming in at number 2, we have Monster of Theseus. This is a level 5 tuner fusion monster with the shortest card text in Yu-Gi-Oh! 2 tuners, its summoning requirement. This card was another one hyped by Konami itself, ages before its set came out. This TCG exclusive card was said to be the strongest card of 2017. To put things into context, 2017 was the year when Zodiacs came out, who were the centerpiece of countless formats until their good XCs were all banned. This was also when the True Dracos were released, another archetype which saw lots of play for years, including their boss monster's Masterpiece, which is still banned to this day. Among these two and countless other titans in the meta, including other cards such as Pre-Errata Firewall Dragon and Ash Blossom, this non-effect monster was supposed to be the strongest monster of that year. Now, Konami's reasoning was that since Elder Entity Norden was now banned, this card would take its place as the instant fusion target of choice. Norden was the reason why instant fusion saw play in pretty much every deck back in the day, since it was one of the easiest ways to spam materials on the field, and it was even summoned using the usual way of fusion substitute in Zodiac decks due to how strong it was. In the article released to hype this card up to the player base, they talked about how you could use it to go into synchros for decks that generally couldn't. Being able to suddenly make something like Black Rose Dragon or Cyframe Lord Omega in decks that normally couldn't were decent plays at the time, but nothing that would shake up the meta like the previously mentioned cards. The issue with Theseus is how much extra deck investment it took up to actually do anything, while also requiring you to hard draw instant fusion and already have bodies on the field in order to make use of it. Of course, there was massive disappointment for the player base who were expecting a TCG exclusive that broke the game once again. At the very least, this card actually got better with time, since Christian Hockey Fibrax gives you a really nice payout for having a tuner body on the field. And despite instant fusion being limited, you now have a higher chance of being able to access him due to the release of Retort Fusion. Though none of that changes how much of a disappointment this card when it was revealed. And finally, at number 1, to no one's surprise, we have the Noble Knights. The Noble Knights are an archetype comprised mostly of warrior monsters and their weapons, with the Noble Arms sub-archetype. They first came out during the XCs era, being released in small batches with every coming set. Starting out with the vanilla with Noble Knight Artorius. These TCG exclusive cards hogged lots of high rarity spots in older sets, much to the dismay of whoever bought them. On the third or so wave of support, the player base could already tell the whole archetype wasn't going to amount much to anything, having lots of their cards being based on some of the worst mechanics in Yu-Gi-Oh! With Geminis and equip spells. When the first piece of support came out, the strategy couldn't lift a candle against the meta strategies at the time in Mermails and Fire Fists. The deck's main play was to try to summon out their Xyz monster with a bunch of equip spells to protect it, something which wasn't very good in the first place, and it couldn't even do it consistently. For a couple of years, accompanying every new Noble Knight card release, there would be a Konami article calling it the new meta contender. This kept going all the way until the Duelist Alliance era, where they would infamously say a Noble Knight with a bunch of equip spells was the best out in the meta to shut all construct. The cards weren't completely hopeless, and some of the later pieces of support were even quite decent, earning this deck a couple of tops throughout the years, but it was not nearly the game breaker as Konami's fanfare would let you on. This subpar archetype got countless pieces of support, its own box set, and even its own exclusive rarity at some point in Platinum Rare. It was a shame how mediocre it was, due to how much it cost and how gorgeous some of the artwork was. But at least this archetype made up for it with the cards it got years later, deep in the Link era. Isolde, Two Tales of Noble Knights, broke the meta with Gokis at release as an amazing tool for Warrior Link spam. She didn't really have anything to do with the main deck Noble Knights, but because of it needing equipped spells to go to the graveyard to use its second effect, it led to some Noble Arms cards seen play as Isolde Garnets. Later on, Infernobles, another sub-archetype of the Noble Knights, would eventually become a tier 1 strategy for a while. But even if they did make a good new support eventually, that doesn't change how much of a disappointment the original Noble Knights were at first, especially since the Infernobles don't really use any of the support from the early Noble Knights. So, Noble Knights are still mocked to this day as the most overhyped series of cards ever printed at Yu-Gi-Oh! Alright, and that's the list. If you happen to know of any other super hyped cards we might have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one, please let us know down in the comments.